Welcome to Cover Book Beat. I'm your host, Roger Nichols. Now, while many people enjoy a nice glass of wine occasionally, and others take classes and enjoy learning more about this complex beverage, some go far deeper into the experience. Our guest today actually left his family's real estate and parking business in Washington, D.C., moved his family to France, and not just to sample wines, but to take part eventually in their creation. His boutique winery, Domaine Alex Gambal, included some of France's greatest vineyards. In fact, he became the very first non-Frenchman ever to own one of the Montrachet Grand Cru Vineyards in Burgundy. After more than a quarter century, he was able to sell his business to one of the largest winemakers in the region, and today he spends his time in the mountains, hosting at the Jackson Hole Mountain Resort as the ski host. He is also an avid hiker and a grandfather. His book, Climbing the Vines in Burgundy, How an American Came to Own a Legend, is a fascinating account of his adventures. And whether you are a professional sommelier or someone who knows only that there's some sort of difference between the red and white, you will find a compelling story in Climbing the Vines in Burgundy, How an American Came to Own a Legend. We're very pleased to welcome its author, Alex Gambal.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
You know, the word climbing in the title is kind of an unusual choice of verb when dealing with grapevines, which are pretty short. So I have this mental picture of someone small pulling themselves up on the vines. How did you choose that?
It was one of those, it was hard to come up with a name. It's interesting. This is the first book I've ever written. And, you coming up with a catchy title is not easy. And so the whole idea was the work, the struggle, I don't like using, but the effort it took to actually be successful in the business, in the wine business, not to mention doing it in one of the oldest and most traditional wine regions in the world. And actually, I think our editor or someone, one of my friends, suggested it, and then we kind of tweaked it, and it sounded. Some people said it sounds like you're like a Jack and the Beanstalk. But I think that is also the whole idea was a goal, and I've always been very goal oriented and focused. And when I put my mind to something, it's hard to get me to stop. I'm pretty tenacious that way.
Yeah, a few children, at least in this country, dream of making wine when they grow up. How do you think, this is a weird question, how do you think the childhood you would react if you could see what you would become?
I would have never imagined it. I really wouldn't have. It was one of those things. I think through life, I've always been a very curious person. I look at things from oftentimes, from 10,000, the proverbial 10,000 feet. And it finally, after, and as I write in the book, I enjoyed what I was doing in a career in the family business, but there were a lot of other factors that led me. I knew that I was fundamentally very much like my father, very much of an independent entrepreneurial type who doesn't like to be, especially when you're telling me, no, I can't do it, I'm definitely going to do it. And I think that's part of it. But no, I would have never expected that. Not at all.
You mentioned you have an unusual ability to remember the taste of wine even much later. In fact, I want to quote you, and this is really fascinating to me. Say, I see the wine and it takes on its own form, color, and personality. I remember it like I remember a face, a person, a moment in time. That's a huge advantage in the business, is it not?
It is, and it's kind of curious because when I talk to other wine professionals, you'll read reviews and they talk about the fruit and this and that. That is important, but it's not really. It's the total, if you will, the totality of the wine. And I'm not talking box wine or most of the stuff you get on the grocery shelf. We're talking a very small percentage of of fine wine from the fine wine growing regions, in California, in Italy, in Spain, and obviously France. So we're talking a very small percentage, but it was one of these gifts that I always joke in France, files of different clients are kept in different colors rather than kind of plain manila. I can remember the color of the client's file. Now that's so random and so useless, but that's kind of how I approach it. And again, and then it's more, and it's not so much the flavor, it's texture. What's the texture of the wine? How's the wine composed? Is I write a lot about, it's a gastronomy and and wine are it's all about it's a fine art at that highest level. And when you go to the best Michelin restaurants, you're dealing with a small percentage, and you're dealing with a lot of nuance. And a lot of people go, okay, I just want my steak, and I like steaks too. But when I got into it, I was spoiled. I had some great friends who spoiled me early on, and that those kind of sensory experiences I remember. Or if you go to some people remember the scores. I mean, I've always been amazed that you talk to a Major League Baseball pitcher, he will remember every pitch and the situation he threw it in years later.
Mm-hmm.
And I go, what? Or baseball players. And I think it's kind of in that same genre.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you mentioned the word nuance, because at one point you're right. Embracing nuance is a much richer and more interesting way to live. It requires patience, a patience most Americans do not have. How long did it take you to embrace nuance?
Pretty quickly with the wine. But
Mm-hmm.
what I'm talking about there is the whole French lifestyle. And I think I also talked about the French love grays. I mean, Americans, we are goal oriented, as I said, I am very objective. I've had Americans come in, why don't you get all these vines, consolidate the vines, and get some economies of scale? And then I try to explain to them why you can't. And they go, well, this is a stupid business. And I go, yeah, it is a crazy, dumb business, but it's a wonderful, rich life I had with some fantastic people and making an extraordinary product in an extraordinary place. I was just very, very fortunate.
I think one of the things that I really appreciate was your discussions of the cultural differences between the two countries. And one of the things that impressed me the most is about in Burgundy, kids are kids for longer. And that whole system is kind of refreshing for those of us who deal with kids glued to their cell phones every second these days.
Yeah, and I think it's changed a lot. I wrote that when we got there 30, almost 25, 30 years ago, when we got there, my children were 8 and 10 years old. But even then, we were already running around, what after school activity, how many soccer games, how many t-ball games can you, run after? And I think that was one of the big differences. And also, remember, we were living in the country. I mean, Burgundy is farm. It's high end farming, but it's farming. And so we lived that first year in a little village of, what did I say, 100 and some people, and then in the town of Beaune there may be 20,000 people. So you're talking small, close knit farming communities, and then the whole French system is always more slow. And that's why, Americans love going there on vacation, but why it's very, very hard when you have an American personality and outlook to, let's get stuff done. And so I had to learn to, if you will, pardon the pun, curb my enthusiasm, so to speak. And it's even now I go, when I go back, I go, let's get some things done. But I learned to adapt to that speed.
In one interview you did, you mentioned your kids as a secret weapon. Tell us about that.
Well, I think it's, people always say, how are you, the question is, how are you accepted? And I think you got to understand, people, when they read the book, they'll understand that, we moved there as a family, again, 30 years ago, and we were the only Americans in the region at the time. And we didn't want to have an expat experience, which I knew a lot of expats in Paris, and all their friends were just like other expats or North Americans. And I go, well, I can stay at home and have that experience. So the idea was put the kids in French schools. And my wife and I thought, if they're happy, we could stay a longer time, maybe 3 or 4 years. If they were unhappy, we'd go home after a year, and would there be no downside? And right away, they were kind of like the rock stars. Who are these cute American kids coming in? They were an anomaly. And, in a small village like that, most of their friends' parents are winemakers. I mean, this is a small community. People are involved either winemaking or the bottles, the suppliers, the tractor suppliers. So all, it's like any community. And as a young parent, we were in our mid-30s. Who are your friends? They are your children's friends' parents. And that's how it was. So excuse me. So through birthdays, Christmas, Easter, marriages, funerals, end of the year school barbecues, sports events, innumerable soccer matches, you meet like-minded parents, and oftentimes they're winemakers and they brought a bottle, because how many 10-year-old soccer matches can you watch in the cold rain of February in France?
Yes.
So it makes it go a lot easier, and that's how we made friends. I mean,
and that, I guess I didn't understand whether you first got there, you weren't intending to be a winemaker, you just wanted to enjoy some, and then they kind of gradually sneaked up on you.
Yeah, it did sneak up on me. I think that's Roger. That's a good way to put it. So I went there to help this American woman, a very successful exporter, marketer, who had been there, who got there in 1968, and she discovered a lot of these great winemakers now that get these perfect scores in the wine magazines. And then and I worked with her for 3 years, helping basically recapitalize the business, manage the business, do sales. And many of these winemakers she was working with, we were all basically baby boomers. We were all in our mid-30s. So they became my friends. And, and they were my teachers. I think I can't stress that enough. I mean, I would take American clients around, do the translation, try to get the orders, and would taste these wines many times throughout the year, and learned the whole process of winemaking through these multiple tastings over a 3-year period. And then there was the transition of, we thought, what are we going to do with our children? Because we wanted them to go to U.S. high schools and U.S. colleges. So it took us a year to transition into France. Then it took us a year to transition out of France. And during that's the year I decided to go to the wine school in Burgundy. Frankly, at the beginning, I didn't think about making wine. I thought I could do it. I wasn't sure. I thought it would be a good experience, and I would decide afterwards. But I knew I'd be in the wine business somehow afterwards. But when I first got into it, it didn't appear that clearly until about January, February, when I put together of a small boutique winery. So it was a process.
Yeah, exactly. And your start was, I would think you'd start by going out and buying some property, but that's not the way you started.
No, it's not as if there's property for sale. And in a couple of the chapters, I talk about the difficulty on the one hand, and then the strategic advantage you can take in actually buying land. But it's very, very difficult. And they're always small pieces. But at the time, it was relatively easy, if you will, to buy grapes. And this is basically how the business works throughout the world. Mm-hmm. In the United States, you have basically grape growers and winemakers, and a handful who grow their own grapes and make their own wine. But in a place like Burgundy, people grow their own grapes, make their own wine, and very often will sell off their grapes or their semi-finished wine. And this is in bulk. And I don't like to use the word bulk because this is high-end bulk. But what you have are these multiple small farmers that don't have either the inclination to take that wine that they fermented and put in barrel and put it in bottle and then sell it. I mean, these are all very different steps, professions. And it takes, when you prefer, or you don't have enough not a big enough operation, you need to be on your tractor all the time. So what they would do is they might put a little bit in bottle, then sell off a certain number of grapes, or sell some of this just finished wine in barrel. And that's how I started initially, buying this just finished wine in barrel, doing what we call the élevage, or barrel aging, as we call it in English, and then bottling it under my name. with the name of the vineyard I bought, of the name of the vineyard the grapes came from.
Yeah.
And then within a couple of years, I was buying them primarily, mostly all grapes, and then doing the vinification, the fermentations myself. And then finally, in about 04, 05, was I right? I felt like the business, the whole fundamentals of the business were changing. It was getting more and more difficult to find these good grapes, and they were getting terribly expensive. And I basically was becoming a financial factoring service, as other people like me were, whether you were large or small. It takes a huge amount of capital. We were basically financing the farming of these small farmers. And I felt like I needed to get away from that and start buying land and having my own independent, if you will, fully integrated operation, if that makes sense.
It does. And sometimes that's the best way to do it. So the skill sets for the farming, the bottling, the selling, those are all kind of different, but you've managed to combine them all. And did you get much sleep?
After my first harvest, I ran into this American woman, friend of ours, and she goes, "Alex, you look terrible. You're skinny. When was the last time you ate?" And I go, "I don't remember." It was a lot of hours, and because I couldn't afford to hire people, I would hire people part-time. I would bring in young Americans who would basically, I'd buy them food and they would help me do it to have the experience. But it was when I look back, actually, when I write it, and I look back and I go, did I do that? it was tough. It was tough. But the skill set piece is interesting, because when you go to the wine school, and again, I write this in the book, it's not strictly enology or the chemistry. We learn the chemistry a bit, the biology, the botany, the geology, how the tractor works, a lot of business classes, which were easy for me because I'd been doing that my whole life. Also, the tasting was easy. But, when you get into those sciences in a different language, it was challenging. It was challenging for me. And what this program produces is basically, we're generalists. Mm-hmm. We know enough to be dangerous. And then you end up hiring someone to do certain pieces of it. So over time, at the end, I had a full-time vineyard manager. I had a full-time caviste, winemaker, if you will. I had another person doing a lot of, basically it becomes a big, small business. And originally I did everything, but then at the end, you can't do everything. You have to have help.
Mm-hmm. When you get beyond a certain point, you just can't do it. They don't have hours.
You just can't do it. And then, and what happens is that, I was basically the salesman for this stuff. And people come in and, I'm doing tastings all the time. And, in Burgundy, if you can get an appointment with one of these great winemakers, he or she will come in, drive their tractor and take their overalls off, or maybe they're the overalls that where they've been spraying and they're covered in sometimes in the copper sulfate, which we spray, and then they'll do the tasting, they put them back on and get on the tractor. This is farming. It's not glamour. People would always say, "Oh, take me to your chateau," and I go, well, it's like, take me to your leader. We don't have chateau. I had at the end 30 acres, 40, 45 separate parcels. Now, some very close together, but you can begin to imagine how hard that is to manage, and the fact that there is no economies of scale. Each parcel has to be looked at, picked separately. Then the reality of, how do you bring those grapes in? Do you have enough tanks? All this kind of stuff. And I love that. I love logistics of it. And remember, I was making, we only have as two grapes, Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, but yet I was making 30 different wines a year, sometimes 35, sometimes where you're only making a couple barrels, 3 barrels of the Grand Cru, the Batard Montrachet, making 750, 900 bottles a year. That's a labor of love.
One of the things I enjoyed about the book was, again, more about the cultural differences. And as an old poli-sci grad, I was fascinated to talk about the way that the French think about economics and that they do some central controls, things like they can only have sales at certain times with the idea that nobody should have an unfair advantage over another. And you mentioned that comes from the guild system.
Well, it came. I mean, I can't say. I tend to exaggerate a little bit,
Uh,
but okay. But you can actually trace it because in the medieval times in the guild system, basically, if you wanted to make a better shoe, okay, you couldn't because the guild said how many nails went into your shoe. They did. So basically, it was it was a command economy, if you will, what they used to call it. And so you had this system. So if you were in the guild, you made money. Didn't mean the shoes were good. And then you literally couldn't advertise. I mean, I don't think you could have a sign, and they didn't, or at least they didn't want you to. And literally, I read this in a history book. You couldn't stand out, with your arms folded, trying to kind of catch someone's eye to get them to come in to buy your shoes. Now it's beyond our, then we can't even imagine it. And I'm not saying it's like that in France, because there's nobody better in the world with high-end luxury goods and marketing than the French. But so there's this dichotomy between being great marketers and being too pushy. I think that's maybe a way to look at it. And so, you learn, how to adapt. And then to a certain degree, because I was American, I could get away with some things that other people couldn't. With my bad French accent, which they said was très charmant, very charming. Just like when we hear somebody French speaking and trying to speak English, we go, "Oh, it's so cute." And so, but I learned one of my first trips. I can't remember if I put this in the book. I don't think I did. I wanted to. My first trips back to the States when I was working for the exporter for Becky. I was sitting next to this Frenchman who'd been in the United States since 1957. And he was a rabid American and a rabid Frenchman. And he said to me, "Alex, don't think you're ever going to be French. Just like I know I'm never going to be American. But know more about the French than the French know about themselves. Don't go around with a baguette under your arm and a beret. Be an American, but know the culture, and then they'll respect you." And that was some of the best advice I'd ever gotten. So I understand what they're doing. I can make jokes. I can make them laugh at themselves. Yet I'm not trying to change them because it's impossible. So yeah, I think it's I think that kind of gets to what we're talking about. And a lot of Americans don't want to do that. And you have to have the patience for it. But I'm curious, and fundamentally, the French are wonderful people, and they seem a little cold on the outside, but it's when you get to know them, they are real friends. I think in if you will, North America, Anglo-Saxon, as they like to call us all, it can be a little superficial. But with them, and it's hard to become. But when you are friends, I mean, when you're invited over for dinner, I mean, you're there for 4 to 5 hours. I mean, this is not just, okay, in and out in an hour. I mean, people make the effort. And I think that's a real cultural difference.
I also want to note that you sprinkle the account with a number of conversations in French, which you kindly translate as well. But that's kind of fun for people like me who like to practice our 55-year-old high school French, trying to look at the French sentence and figure it out before we read your translation after that. So it's a little bonus.
Well, thank you. And I will tell you a funny story. I was my as I write in the book, my wife passed away 3 years ago, and so my partner Julie, who is my editor, and she's a wonderful. She really helped me kind of finish the book out, and we were both very upset at a lot of the typographical mistakes. So I apologize to everybody. I know they're there. There were some things that weren't caught by the publisher, but the funny part is my daughter, she goes, "Dad, I got a couple things to tell you." I go, "Oh my God," what she's worried about the divorce I had and this and that. She goes, "No, Dad, there's too much French and your French is lousy." I go, "Well, if that all it is, I'm good."
Yeah. That's
because I admit my French is about that two years in high school and that 1 year in college, and I speak like, but as I say, I speak like a madman, but I understand everything and I can read it, and I think
that's
that's the big difference.
that is the key. Well, you some new terms that I learned. One of the things that's so charming is the French word for winery is a dirty barn.
Dirty barn. Did I say that?
It
No.
says I'm quoting here, the chai, the French word for winery, a dirty
Oh,
barn.
no. Okay. I was so chez as in chateau,
Oh,
or the main build. The chez is like the building.
oh,
And then
okay.
in that chapter, I'm comparing it. Basically, the chez is like a chat. I was saying the chez, we're going to go in the chez, is very fancy. It was a dirty barn.
Oh, okay. Now I
Okay,
get it.
that's a comparison. It wasn't particularly, it was not grandiose. Let's put it that way.
All right. I also wanted to comment because I'm bouncing around a little bit. There's so much in this. This is such a rich book. That one of your chapters is Hiroshi Dreams of Burgundy, which is a nice reference to the documentary Jiro Dreams of Sushi, which I really appreciated.
Yeah, and exactly. And I was trying to get people to get that, because this guy Hiroshi is just a sweetheart and always took care of me, and the Japanese always took care of me. And I think that's one of the really warm spots in my travels of sales, which are very difficult when you're on the road as a writer. It's not that glamorous, but when you go to Japan, they would treat you right. And they're just, I mean, I love Japan. I love the Japanese, and just lovely people. And he's a sweetheart. And it's true. He'd come in every year, and in November, first stop was Shea Gamble to have a taste.
That is so good. You talk a lot about relationships here and the ones that you built up. And that's really kind of interesting to be inside your experience for a reader.
Well, thank you. And I wanted to share it because, as I say so often, the wine business appears to be this, either black hole, or this language or religion that only a chosen few understand. And I want to stress to people, it shouldn't be that way, and it doesn't have to be that way. All you got to do is work at it a little bit. And it was it's a paradoxical business. I mean, is that right? Something that everybody loves by and large. Why it's so not transparent is what always bothered me. And I want to just point these things out to people. And I'm not criticizing. I'm just saying this is the reality. And when some of my colleagues, they go, "Well, yeah, you're right. I mean, I may not like what you're saying, but and I'm actually, in a lot of this, I toned it down. There's maybe there's a second book. We'll really get into some of the dirty details. I
Well,
tried to be nice because I'm a nice person.
I'm going to throw one thing at you that I got from another interview that you did back in 2013,
Uh-oh.
where you talked about California in rather disparaging terms. And I'm going to quote you here.
Uh-oh.
The ammo in California, where irrigation and shade could be programmed continuously in order to make the perfect grape and therefore the perfect wine, aka a Parker 100 pointer, is scandalous, full of hypocrisy, and just downright wrong. Do you still feel that way 10 years later?
Yeah,
Okay.
because I on the side in 2016, 17, 18 made some wine in Santa Barbara. And trying to make things that are not California in style, high alcohol, big fruit bombs, a lot of new oak, all that kind of. It was, and we made the first year a couple hundred cases. In third year, maybe 700, and we have 100 cases left that I'm trying to sell. And last night we did a charity event, and I served my 2016 Chardonnay from California, and people who don't like Chardonnay or California Chardonnay go, "Wow." I mean, most California wines don't last 7 years. This thing was fresh, lively, lemon with a little bit of richness. And I think that's what I wanted to accomplish. And it was interesting. Years ago at a tasting, a woman asked me, "Why can't Californians make wine like you do in France?" I said, "Well, I think they can, In fact, that's what I'm doing. But can you sell it?
Hmm.
And I think that's really what I'm saying, is that it doesn't fit the flavor profile of what Americans like. And Americans say they don't necessarily like sweet things, but they love sweets. Americans are sugar freaks. And so many of these wines have this sugar fruit quality to them that is delicious, but you're getting high alcohol, sometimes residual sugar, and people would then wonder why they have a hangover the next day.
You get some
It's
of those get pretty close to the ports and in terms of alcohol content.
Well, that's exactly my point, Roger, is that when I started drinking wine in the mid or late 80s, you'd have a glass of port. It was 16%, 16.5%. These still red and white wines are in that level. I mean, I very often, my California friends are going to hate me. I mean, when people pour these, super duper rated wines, I pour water into it because I can't handle it. I'll admit it, I'm a lightweight. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But my wines that are 12 and a half to 13, maybe 13 and a half max, I can drink them all night. The French term is digest. Can you digest? Does it work with food? And when you have these lower alcohol wines with higher acidities, they help you, they make your food you're eating taste better. And then it also helps with the digestion. And I think that's the whole idea of food and wine in France being paired together. And so that's why when you go to the Rhone Valley, you have a different type of cuisine and different type of wines than you'll have in Burgundy or in Bordeaux. It's all, I mean, that's where this idea of this organic quality to food and wine comes together. It's not by happen chance.
And also, for those of us who live in Oregon, you have some nice things to say about Oregon as a wine growing region.
Well, I've got multiple friends there, and I've been up to Oregon at the Pinot Noir Festival for 30 years, multiple times. I have nothing but great memories. The flavor profile of Oregon is very different than it is in Santa Barbara. Mm-hmm. So I did the little project in Santa Barbara because, one, I thought it was a little closer to what we're doing in Burgundy, and two, I already had a lot of Burgundian friends going to Oregon, and I wanted to try something different. So it's typical. I do things more difficult. Why make it easy when you can do it more difficult? Is my motto. But yes, I mean, I love it, and I love the food and wine scene there, and obviously the fish and the salmon bake every year at the Pinot Noir celebration is spectacular. So
I want to make sure that I'm not left out anything you want to make sure that gets in. Is there something I haven't touched on you think is important for your listeners to know?
No, I think what I've also tried to say to a lot of people and is trying to frame the book. It's not just a wine book. It's a combination of Kitchen Confidential, Moneyball, a bit of Julia Child thrown in, the American experience in France. I love that first scene in the Julia movie, where they're having the Dover sole and it's in butter, and that's and a great glass of Chablis or white or something from Pouligny Montrachet. That's what it's about. And then this whole total life, because for example, A Year in Provence is a fun, wonderful book, but the reality is they had no friends. I mean, their friends were the proverbial butcher, baker, candlestick maker. We had a life, very deep. Pardon the pun, but our feet were in the soil there. We were part of the fabric of that community of Burgundy and France. And the wonderful thing I see now when I go back is many of these children who my kids played with, and they'd come over for lunch or dinner, they're making the wines now because my children are 38 and 41. I mean, I started the business when I was 40. So I get a great deal of pride seeing these young men and women making wine there, knowing we've turned it over to them. They're the next generation. And I write about that's one of the reasons I decided to sell. I thought it was time to let a new generation figure out how to make the good wines, make wonderful wines, but also how to deal with some of the climactic issues we're facing. the sales issue, lots of interesting. There are a lot of hurdles that the next generation are going to have to deal with, and they're going to do fine. But I thought it was time to hand that over to them.
I have one last thing I want to make sure I mention, and that's you mentioned your wife passed away recently, and I want to plug your Diana D. Williams Freestyle Fund and tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you very much. So my wife Diana was second marriage. We met in 2002 and got married in 2007. She was a freestyle skier back in the late 70s, early 80s, basically when they call it hot dog. Mm-hmm. So she was doing aerials, ballet, and moguls. And as all these kids did, and she was doing this in her late teens, early 20s, blew her knee out, ended up coaching, running the Killington Mountain School for 10 years, where multiple world champions came out and Olympic champions. And then she became a coach on the U.S. Olympic team from 98 to 2002 at Salt Lake City. So that was, and then she quote unquote retired. And that's how we met in France, because she spoke beautiful French and took bike tours through France. And she had this wonderful bespoke travel company in France, taking people to wine regions. And in 2018, March of 18, she went in for a routine colonoscopy, though she'd been complaining about stomach pains. And we found out she had stage 4 colon cancer that had already gone to both lobes of her liver. Mm-hmm. And she died 27 months later in the middle of COVID in June 20. So I talk about, our life together, some of the adventures we had. And in her memory, I set up a freestyle fund, a foundation, where we give gifts every year to aspiring young athletes who can't afford to go to some of these special competitions, because it's a bit like golf. It's a rich person sport. Let's be brutally honest about it. And so when she was 16, she came from very modest means, and couldn't go to Europe, couldn't go to these extra special competitions. She didn't have the money. So we're giving out around $5,000 to $10,000 a year, and as gifts. Here's $2,500 to an aspiring. We actually gave money to a young woman on the Olympic team this year, and Olivia Giacoa, and she was 6 at Beijing. So I feel like we're doing the right thing, and so it's the dwilliamfund.com, or just send me an email at alex.gambal@icloud.com, and I'll tell you more about it. Thank you for asking.
You bet. And any final thing you wanted to say?
No, I just hope everyone enjoys the book. Please let me know if you see those darn typos, let me know. It doesn't hurt my feelings in one bit. I've learned to laugh at myself.
Okay. Thanks so much for being with us. Our guest today has been Alex Gambal. The book is Climbing the Vines in Burgundy, How an American Came to Own a Legend. Highest possible recommendation from this source. Thank you so much.
Thank you, my friend.